Maggie Osborne was reputedly a witch from Ayr, and well into the 19th century the townsfolk could point out the house where she lived, but it has since gone. Maggie was said to be the daughter of the Lord of Fale, a famous warlock and a master in the black arts. Her father had instructed her in the profession which he himself was distinguished in. When her mother died, Maggie ran a public house in Ayr for 50 years. At nights, after she'd finished work, she didn't head straight to bed, but instead muttered her charms, rose into the air, and made trips to Galloway, where she bewitched cattle, turned ale sour, charmed wives and maidens, and generally got up to mischief. She always went and came by the same route, crossing Carrick Hill by a path known for many years as Maggie's Gate to Galloway. It was said after she scaled the shoulder of Carrick, she folded her wings or gave her horse a rest. Walking in the countryside, their feet were naturally warm, and they not only scorched the grass, but baked the ground, so no vegetation ever grew there again where their cloven hooves had landed. On one occasion, as she was flying over the Nick of Balloch at dusk, she caught sight of a funeral approaching, and not wishing to be discovered or recognised by the mourners, she transformed herself into a beetle and crept along the road. As the procession passed, she hid in a hollow in the ground made by a horse's hoof, and lay quietly hidden. She came very close to dying herself, as one of the mourners stepped onto the hollow where she was crouched down, and she only escaped death by sheer luck. She knew the man who'd stood on her, and set about his ruin. And she succeeded. One winter's night he sat at his table with his wife and 7 of his 8 children, the eldest being at sea, to have supper. Somehow he accidentally forgot to say grace, and in doing so put himself at risk of the power of Maggie Osborne. She rolled a huge wreath of snow onto his house. Under the weight of it, the man and his family were crushed and smothered to death. However, she wasn't quite finished meting out her vengeance. Returning home, she learned by an incantation that the sailor's son was in a vessel in the Bay of Ayr, and planned his ruin. Witches had exceptional power over the weather, so she decided to use it. First, she instructed her maidservant to put some water in the mash tun, and to set an ale cup to sail in it, then retired to her garret, where she called in the help from the devil. She then set about raising a storm. The girl stood by the bottom of the stair, waiting for instructions. Maggie told her to go to the tun and find out what portion of the surface the cup was floating on. The servant did as ordered, and found the cup gently floating on the ripples on the surface of the water, and in the very centre of the tun. "That will do," said Maggie, when the maid told her, "but in a few minutes you must return to the brew-house and bring the particulars as before." On going the second time, the servant was amazed to find the water violently agitated, the tiny waves washing over the rim of the tun, and the ale-cup being thrashed about. Worse still, faintly and far off, she heard what sounded like cries of men in distress, screaming for help. She turned back to the stair and called out to the witch, informing her of what she'd seen and heard. "They will cry long ere I pity them," said Maggie, but go again." Trembling, the girl obeyed. The water was still once again, but the cup had sunk to the bottom. When the servant told the witch, she smiled as she remarked, "The devil has served me well for once." As the storm had raged, a great storm had picked up out in the bay, and as the ale cup was smashed about, so a vessel was driven on the high waves by the violence of the hurricane. As the girl heard the far-off cries of drowning men, outside the night winds carried the sounds of the men on the foundering vessel, and as the ale cup went down in the tun, so the boat was driven on to the jagged back of the Nicholas Rock. The ship was lost with all hands, including the son of the man whose foot nearly crushed the witch as she hid in the hollow in the road. Following that night of Maggie's incantation, the servant girl fell out with her, and she sent her to work in the brewhouse at night. One night, while carrying out her work, a number of fierce cats entered and began fighting with one another. The girl left them to it, but one of the cats, a large and particularly savage one, sprang at her throat, hoping that she would fall into the boiling warts behind her. However, the girl defended herself, and dipping the ladle into the warts, she threw its contents among the cats, taking care that the one which had attacked her received the biggest share of the scalding liquid. The cats took flight, and screeching, vanished into the night. The next morning, Maggie was ill in bed. The girl went upstairs to visit her, and was not at all unhappy to find her mistress lying on her couch, groaning in pain. Maggie didn't say what was wrong, and refused to get up, but the maid pulled down the bedclothes, and discovered that her mistress was suffering from a series of blisters on her back. To her this was proof her mistress was indeed a witch, and she reported Maggie to the local magistrates. Maggie was soon apprehended and put in prison. Although the devil never seemed to free his devotees from prison, he informed Maggie on how she could escape from the stake. She required 2 pewter plates, which were to be fastened to her shoulders, and once attached, she would rise into the air after the fire had been lit. As she rose, Old Nick would envelop her in the smoke from the fire and carry her off to safety. The plates, it was stipulated, were to be brand new and unwashed, as the devil advised her that if they were wet, they couldn't act as wings. The morning came on which Maggie was to go to the stake. At the Cross of Ayr was a large crowd, along with a number of ministers who had come to see justice done. Maggie was remorseful and admitted her guilt, but in order to make reparations, the authorities would only need to bring her 2 new pewter plates, which had never been wet. She would then reveal the mysteries which would help them unmask witchcraft in others. The authorities, anxious to learn about necromancy, agreed to her request and dispatched a messenger for the plates. In his haste, he stumbled and fell, and one of the plates got wet. He thought that a well-dried plate would do, so dried it off vigorously. Maggie was tied to the stake by the time he arrived at the cross. The plates were handed to her, and she fixed them to her shoulders, and to the amazement of the crowd, instantly began slowly to rise. Unfortunately, the pewter wings that had been wet refused to act as they should, and prevented her from soaring out of the reach of one of the guards, who hooked his halbert into her petticoats and brought her back down. The magistrates immediately had the plates removed. As the flames grew higher, she was overheard addressing the devil, who, although invisible, stood beside her. "O ye false loon, instead o' a black goon, ye hae gi'en me a red ane. Hae I deserved this for serving ye sae lang?" After a short time, Maggie Osborne, the witch, was dead. Little is known about the real Maggie Osborne, who has been intertwined with this legend. The Osbornes were a well-known family in Ayr, and several of its members occupied positions of prominence in the town. But what branch of the family Maggie belonged to isn't known. She is thought to have been the same person who in November 1648 was appointed by the council to receive the key of the house wherein Isabel Piper died under suspicion of the infection frae John Ferguson, one of the quartermasters, and to intromit with the goods of the house, and to be first command to their said honours conform to one indenture thereof, to be taken and set down in writ. She resided in the High Street in a house opposite the Fish Cross. It was only in the later 19th century the house was demolished. It was known by all as Maggie Osborne's house. Unfortunately, there is a huge gap in the presbytery records extending from 1652 to 1681, and it was during this period that the reputed witch was sent to her death. Council records are equally reticent, as are the criminal records of the county. The story of Maggie has passed into the history of the town. What the indictment on which Maggie was tried isn't known, but whether she danced with other witches in the kirks, wrought incantations with the aid of ghastly relics disinterred from burying grounds, brought about sickness or death by her Satan-bestowed charms, or flew transversely across the moon, will forever remain a mystery. Her case must have been a bad one, however, for the magistrates of Ayr were lenient in their dealings with witches, as recorded in the local records. In 1596, a woman from Galloway, Margaret Reed, was brought before the magistrates, charged with witchcraft. She was considered guilty, and banished from the borough. If ever found within their jurisdiction, she was to be punished without further assize or process. If there is some truth in the legend, then Maggie was not treated quite so leniently.